In Birmingham, Alabama, 2023, Harold Simmons looked untouchable. At 48, he had the kind of reputation people didn't question. He worked for Alabama Power, kept his house in order, and served as a deacon in his church. In a community where faith and family still meant everything, Harold was seen as the model. People trusted him. They went to him for rides, advice, or prayer. On Sundays, he stood in front of the congregation, Bible in hand, speaking with conviction. Neighbors saw a man with discipline, respect, and authority. On the surface, Harold Simmons was everything he claimed to be. But a perfect image doesn't mean a perfect person. And Harold's wasn't. By early 2023, small cracks began to show. Neighbors noticed his truck pulling in late at night, long after his supposed work shifts ended. Others spotted him in parts of Birmingham far outside his usual routine. Inside the church, people whispered about his distractions, stepping out mid-service, checking his phone more than usual, less engaged with the congregation he once guided closely. It wasn't enough to bring suspicion crashing down, but it was enough to plant questions. Why was Harold changing? Why did a man who seemed so steady start moving differently? At the time, nobody had answers. To most, he was still the same deacon they'd known for years. But investigators later pointed to these moments, the late arrivals, the rumors, the subtle shift in behavior, as the first warnings that Harold Simmons wasn't living the life he presented. The public image was still intact. But beneath it, the double life that would end in violence was already taking shape. Behind closed doors, the Simmons household didn't look anything like the picture Harold projected in public. Denise, his wife of nearly 20 years, carried herself with quiet endurance. She had grown used to Harold's explanations for late nights and missed dinners, but her patience was wearing thin. To her sister, Carla Reed, she admitted things weren't right. She didn't know where her husband really went some nights, only that he came home later, more defensive and harder to reach. The tension filtered down to the children. 16-year-old Kayla saw through the excuses. She argued with Harold more openly, pointing out his absences, questioning why he avoided family outings. To friends, she complained that her father wasn't the man everyone else thought he was. The distance between father and daughter widened every month. 10-year-old Malik saw things differently. He idolized his dad. When Harold was home, Malik clung to him, eager for his attention, desperate for approval. He talked about him constantly at school and wanted to follow in his footsteps. Malik's admiration created a divide. Where Kayla was skeptical and outspoken, Malik defended his father fiercely. Denise stood in the middle of it all. Outwardly, she kept the family image intact. Church, dinners, birthdays, but inside she was stretched thin. Carla noticed. During visits, she picked up on Denise's guarded comments and the way she seemed exhausted when Harold's name came up. Carla later told investigators that the marriage looked like it was holding together, but you could feel it slipping. This was the reality inside the Simmons home in early 2023. A family that looked stable from the outside but was already being pulled apart by secrets, arguments, and the growing suspicion that Harold Simmons was living a life no one in his house truly understood. Investigators would later uncover what Harold Simmons worked so hard to hide. A relationship that started in Birmingham years before the shooting and never let go. Her name was Taran Mitchell, a 29-year-old trans woman from the West End side of the city. Friends described her as outgoing, sharp-tongued, and unafraid to speak her mind. She had worked retail and service jobs, but her real struggle was stability. That need for security pulled her into Harold's orbit. The two met in 2020 when he went for a personal street evangelism. At first, it was casual. Harold offered rides, bought meals, handed out cash here and there. But the connection didn't end. It grew into late-night phone calls, discreet meetups, and eventually a relationship Harold refused to acknowledge in public. The places they met told the story. Cheap motels lined along US 280, hotel receipts later pulled by detectives, and text records showing Harold arranging times when he claimed to be working late. Taran expected secrecy at first. She understood what it meant to be connected to a married man who held a church title. But the longer it went on, the more the balance shifted. By 2022, friends said Taran was no longer satisfied with being hidden. She pressed him for recognition, for something more permanent than envelopes of cash and unmarked motel rooms. Investigators later retrieved messages where she demanded he stop acting like I don't exist. For Harold, the double life was about control, maintaining his public image while indulging a side of himself he couldn't risk exposing. For Taran, it was about not being discarded. The relationship turned volatile. She threatened to show up unannounced. He responded with excuses, then with anger, then with more money to quiet her down. This was the secret life running parallel to the Simmons picture-perfect home. While neighbors praised Harold's discipline and his congregation saw him as a man of faith, he was living a relationship in shadows, one built on secrecy, cash, and mounting resentment. It was only a matter of time before those two worlds collided. By early 2023, Harold Simmons' double life was cracking. At home, Denise had stopped buying his excuses. He came in late claiming overtime, but the hours didn't add up. His phone, once left on the counter, was now kept in his pocket. She caught texts at odd hours, messages cleared before she could ask questions. Denise confided in her sister, Carla Reed, that something was wrong. She suspected another woman, but she had no proof. Carla later told investigators that Denise's patience was thin and her trust nearly gone. Meanwhile, Taran Mitchell was no longer playing by Harold's rules. What began as discreet meetings turned into boundary-crossing appearances. She showed up near his job site on more than one occasion, waiting in her car. Once, a coworker mentioned seeing Harold arguing quietly with a young woman in a parking lot. Harold brushed it off, but the story lingered. The text messages were harder to dismiss. Detectives would later recover threads where Taran sent vague but pointed lines, "You can't hide me forever. What would your wife say if she knew the truth?" They weren't direct threats, but they carried weight. For Harold, every ping on his phone became a reminder that his two lives were moving closer to colliding. He grew paranoid. At church, people noticed him stepping outside mid-service, pacing on his phone. At home, he snapped at Denise for minor questions. To his daughter Kayla, it looked like constant defensiveness. To Malik, it was confusing. To Harold, it was fear. The fear of being exposed in front of his family, his congregation, and his community. By the spring, the secrecy wasn't holding. Denise was suspicious. Taran was pressing harder. And Harold Simmons was running out of room to maneuver. The life he worked so hard to protect was edging toward collapse. For Harold Simmons, secrecy was survival. For Taran Mitchell, it became a slow-burning insult. By 2023, she had been involved with Harold for nearly 3 years. What began as excitement, attention from an older man with resources and stability, had curdled into anger and resentment. Friends later testified that Taran was tired of the constant hiding. She told one close confidant, "I'm good enough for him in the dark, but never in the light." To her, Harold was pulling all the benefits from the relationship, companionship, intimacy, control, without giving her recognition or respect. She had accepted secrecy in the beginning, but as the months wore on, she began to feel used. The signs of her frustration were everywhere. Taran started posting cryptic messages on Facebook and Instagram. Lines like, "Some men love to preach but live in shadows. Secrets don't stay buried forever," and "You can't build your life on lies." Most of her followers didn't know who she was referencing, but for those who understood, The posts were pointed. Investigators later used those very posts to establish her state of mind leading up to the shooting. Her friends also described a shift in her behavior. Taran became more vocal, less cautious. She admitted she had considered telling Denise directly. She talked about showing up at Harold's church. At times, she seemed torn between wanting him to acknowledge her and wanting revenge for being silenced. She was tired of being a secret, one friend told detectives. She wanted him to choose. And she knew he never would. Text records show her frustrations spilling into her communication with Harold. Detectives recovered threads where she accused him of stringing her along. "You're never gonna leave her. I'm not gonna sit here while you pretend like I don't exist." In one exchange, Harold responded with promises to handle it, but the messages only grew more heated from there. Taran also complained about money. What began as Harold giving her cash to keep things quiet started to feel transactional. She told friends she was tired of being paid off, comparing herself to a problem he was managing instead of a partner he cared about. To her, the cash was proof he was ashamed. To Harold, it was a tool to buy more silence. By late spring, her patience was gone. Witnesses saw her agitated, openly venting that Harold thought he was too good to admit the truth. She was angry at the years wasted and the way he compartmentalized her life. She wanted to be seen, and she wanted him to feel the consequences of keeping her hidden. By the summer of 2023, Harold Simmons' carefully balanced double life was collapsing under its own weight. At home, his wife Denise had gone from suspicion to discovery. In June, while folding laundry, she found a crumpled hotel receipt tucked into Harold's work pants, an overnight charge from a budget motel off US 280. He had told her he was working late that night. Not long after, Denise noticed his phone buzzing with unanswered calls. When she checked the screen, the name was blocked, but the number kept appearing. Later, investigators confirmed those calls were from Taran Mitchell. To Denise, it was confirmation of what she had feared for months. To Harold, it was another fire he couldn't put out. The arguments inside the Simmons home turned explosive. Carla Reed, Denise's sister, later testified that she received late-night calls from Denise describing shouting matches and slammed doors. Kayla, their 16-year-old daughter, openly sided with her mother, accusing Harold of lying and embarrassing the family. 10-year-old Malik tried to shield his father, but even he began asking why his parents fought so often. The home had become a battleground. Meanwhile, Taran's threats grew bolder. Text messages pulled by investigators show her telling Harold, "I'm done being quiet. If you don't tell her, I will." In another exchange, she warned, "Next time, it won't be just messages. People are gonna know." These weren't idle words. She had already begun hinting on social media, and Harold knew she had the power to follow through. For Harold, the walls were closing in. At home, Denise no longer believed him. At church, people noticed the change. And Taran was pressing harder than ever, threatening to detonate everything he had spent years building. On July 15, 2023, the Simmons home in Ensley filled with the sounds of balloons inflating, folding tables being set up, and relatives carrying in food trays. It was supposed to be a milestone day, Malik Simmons' 10th birthday. 4 weeks, Denise had quietly prepared, buying decorations and planning a cookout with family and neighbors. By mid-afternoon, the backyard was crowded. Children played tag near the swing set while adults mingled around coolers. A sheet cake sat on the table, decorated with bright blue icing and Malik's name written across the top. On the surface, it looked like any other neighborhood birthday party in Jefferson County. But beneath the laughter, tension was never far. Denise kept her smile fixed, greeting guests politely but staying at the edge of conversations. Carla Reed noticed her sister's distance, telling investigators later that Denise looked like she was there, but not really there. She stayed busy with serving food, avoiding Harold as much as possible. Harold, on the other hand, worked hard to control the atmosphere. Dressed neatly in khakis and a pressed polo, he moved from group to group, shaking hands and asking if anyone needed drinks. To guests, it looked like a typical host making sure the party ran smoothly. To those who knew him well, it seemed forced, almost performative. He was determined to project the image of a united family, even as his wife avoided eye contact and his daughter Kayla barely spoke to him. Neighbors later described the celebration as normal on the outside, tense on the inside. One guest remembered the way Harold's jaw tightened whenever Denise drifted away from him. Another recalled Kayla sitting with her arms crossed, scrolling on her phone while her little brother ran around with friends. Malik, the center of attention, was too excited to notice. For him, the day was about presents, cake, and games. The cracks showed in subtle ways. When Harold tried to pull Denise into a family photo, she resisted, only stepping forward when Carla nudged her. When relatives asked Harold about work, he answered quickly, then changed the subject. Even the way he hovered near the grill, snapping at younger cousins who offered to help, hinted at a man under strain. Despite it all, the party carried on. Children shouted over music, relatives ate barbecue ribs and coleslaw, and balloons bobbed in the July heat. Outwardly, nothing seemed unusual enough to alarm anyone. Guests saw a family gathered for a boy's birthday, a father determined to make it look right, and a mother playing her role quietly. The Simmons backyard was still buzzing with chatter when the moment came that no one expected. Around 5 p.m., with Malik running from table to table showing off his gifts, a new figure appeared at the edge of the yard. It was Taran Mitchell. She hadn't been invited. No one outside Harold knew who she was. But she walked in with purpose, carrying herself with a confidence that froze the party mid-sentence. Guests later recalled the way conversations stopped as people turned toward her. Taran was dressed casually but strikingly, jeans, a fitted top, her hair styled neatly. She wasn't there to blend in. Witnesses described her expression as calm, almost defiant, as if she wanted every eye on her. And she got exactly that. Denise Simmons, standing near the food table, froze when she saw her. Carla Reed, beside her, later told investigators, "You could see Denise go cold." She didn't say a word, but her face said everything. Kayla, the teenage daughter, looked back and forth between her parents, realizing instantly that this woman's presence meant trouble. Malik, too young to understand, kept laughing with his cousins, oblivious to the storm forming. Harold reacted differently. His body stiffened. He moved quickly toward Taran, trying to intercept her before she got further into the yard. Witnesses described his voice low and urgent, but Taran didn't stop. She brushed past him, stepping deeper into the crowd. That's when the whispers began. Guests exchanged confused looks. A neighbor later told detectives, "We didn't know who she was, but you could tell by Harold's face this wasn't good." As she moved through the yard, Taran didn't raise her voice, but she refused to be quiet either. She greeted a few people casually, asked about the food, and stood as if she had every right to be there. To those watching, it was unsettling, an uninvited guest acting like part of the family. Denise never approached her, but her silence spoke volumes. Witnesses said she stood stone still, clutching a plate, her eyes fixed on Harold. Carla eventually guided her sister back inside the house to sit down, knowing the tension was about to boil over. Meanwhile, Harold kept hovering near Taran, pleading with her in hushed tones. But his attempts to move her toward the exit failed. The more he tried, the more obvious it became that something was very wrong. Guests saw his composure slipping. His jaw clenched, his hand gripping the back of a chair too tightly. For those present, the arrival of this unknown woman turned the party on its head. What had been a normal birthday celebration minutes earlier now felt like a scene no one wanted to be caught in. The whispers grew. Who is she? Why is Denise acting like that? What's going on with Harold? What began as whispers quickly broke into open confrontation. With the crowd gathered in Harold Simmons' backyard, the tension between him and Taran Mitchell could no longer be contained. Witnesses recalled the shift. One minute, Harold was trying to usher her aside, speaking low and fast. The next, voices rose. Taran stepped forward, louder now, her words cutting through the chatter. Guests later testified that they heard accusations, fragments that stopped people cold. You're not going to keep acting like I don't exist. You've been lying for years. You think you can hide me forever? The backyard went silent. All around, relatives and neighbors froze, piecing together what her words implied. It didn't take long. A respected deacon, a man known for discipline and control, being accused of a secret relationship in front of his wife and children, it was the kind of exposure Harold feared most. Denise Simmons stood at the center of it, her face locked. Witnesses described her as motionless at first, then stepping forward, demanding answers. Is it true? She asked, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Harold tried to hush her, to lower the volume, but Denise pressed harder. Years of suspicion now had a face, a voice, and undeniable confirmation. 16-year-old Kayla didn't need details. She heard enough, lying, years, hiding, to realize her instincts had been right all along. Witnesses saw her turn away in disgust, muttering under her breath. 10-year-old Malik, still too young to understand it fully, heard just enough to sense betrayal. He stood frozen by the swing set, clutching a toy in silence. The argument escalated. Harold's voice rose, trying to control the situation, but Taran refused to back down. She repeated her involvement, years long, dismissing his attempts to silence her. Some guests recalled Denise's reaction, her voice sharp, telling Harold he had humiliated their family in front of everyone. Neighbors and relatives shifted uncomfortably, caught between staying and leaving. No one wanted to be in the middle of what had become a public reckoning. The whispers that once circulated quietly in Jefferson County had just been confirmed out loud. Harold's world, so carefully constructed, collapsed in minutes. The image of a disciplined deacon, the trusted man of faith and family, was destroyed in front of dozens of witnesses. His wife now knew. His children had heard enough. And his community had seen him exposed. Investigators would later describe this as the point of no return, the moment Harold Simmons lost control of the double life he fought so hard to protect. What began as a child's birthday party had turned into the unraveling of his most guarded secret, laid bare in his own backyard. Then, in a moment no one expected, Harold turned and stormed into the house. Several guests assumed he was retreating to avoid further embarrassment. Instead, within minutes, he returned, this time holding a handgun. What followed was chaos. Witnesses described screams breaking out as Harold lifted the weapon. Taran, still standing firm, barely had time to react before the shots rang out. Harold fired multiple rounds, striking her in the chest and abdomen. She collapsed onto the living room floor, her body motionless before stunned guests. The scene was catastrophic. Balloons that had floated against the ceiling were suddenly popping from the noise of gunfire. Plates of food and cups scattered as people dove for cover. The birthday cake, half cut on the table, sat untouched as children shrieked. Denise froze at first, then screamed Harold's name. Kayla, 16, cried out in shock, pushing Malik behind her as the 10-year-old tried to run forward in confusion. Carla Reed pulled Denise toward the doorway, shouting for everyone to get out. Neighbors scrambled through the back door and into the yard, some calling 911, others clutching their children. But Harold wasn't finished. Witnesses said he stood over Taran briefly, his hand trembling with the weapon still raised, before lowering it. The look on his face, described later by investigators, was one of rage followed by instant realization of what he had done. The Simmons home, decorated for a child's birthday, had become a crime scene. Colorful streamers hung over walls now echoing with screams. Chairs were overturned, the floor smeared with spilled drinks, and in the center of it all lay the body of Taran Mitchell, her life taken in front of dozens of people. Police reports later confirmed that multiple 911 calls came in at once, neighbors describing a man shooting a woman in front of kids, while some said, a man shooting a man in front of kids. When officers arrived minutes later, they found guests gathered outside, some sobbing, some in shock, all pointing toward the house. Inside, Harold stood by the kitchen doorway, the gun still in his hand. He surrendered without resistance. Forensic teams later collected shell casings from the living room floor, just feet away from the birthday decorations. They photographed the cake still sitting on the table, balloons deflated above the scene, and presents stacked in the corner. The images became haunting symbols of a celebration turned nightmare. The shooting of Taran Mitchell was not just an act of violence, it was the collapse of Harold Simmons' double life, detonated in the most public way possible, with his own family forced to watch. When officers from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office arrived at the Simmons home, they stepped into a scene of devastation. Deputies immediately disarmed Harold Simmons, who was standing near the kitchen doorway with the gun lowered in his hand. He surrendered without resistance, saying nothing as he was placed in handcuffs and escorted outside. Witnesses later remembered the image. The same deacon who once led prayers now being walked through his own backyard in silence, past balloons and toys scattered across the grass. Detectives secured the home as crime scene tape went up. Inside, forensic teams documented everything. The shell casings on the carpet, the untouched cake, the streamers hanging above the body. Photographs taken that evening captured a stark contrast between celebration and tragedy. Witness interviews began immediately. Guests described the argument, Taran's accusations, Harold's attempts to quiet her, and the sudden eruption of violence. Many were still shaking, their voices breaking as they relived what they had seen. Children, some barely old enough to understand, told investigators they saw Mr. Simmons yelling and the lady fall down. Their statements would later be sealed to protect their identities, but the trauma was clear. Denise Simmons provided one of the most devastating accounts. In her statement, she told detectives about months of suspicion, late nights, strange texts, and finally, the receipt she found that confirmed her fears. She said Harold had lied to her repeatedly, and that watching him gun down Taran in front of their children destroyed whatever was left of our family. Denise's testimony would later form the backbone of the prosecution's narrative, that Harold killed not in self-defense, but to silence exposure and humiliation. Investigators quickly seized Harold's phone, along with Taran's device recovered by family members. The records revealed everything. Text threads showed Taran threatening to reveal the relationship. Screenshots captured her frustration and Harold's frantic attempts to placate her. Financial records tied Harold to cash withdrawals that matched the times he met her, and motel receipts documented their secret meetings along US 280. The evidence painted a clear picture. Harold Simmons had been living a double life for years, paying to keep it hidden, and when exposure came, he chose violence. Within hours, Harold was booked into the Jefferson County Jail. He was charged with murder, with prosecutors later adding firearm enhancements. The deacon who once stood before a congregation was now wearing an orange jumpsuit, facing the weight of a system that had little sympathy for his downfall. For the Simmons family, there was no relief, only shock and grief. For investigators, the case was no longer about what Harold had built, but about what he had destroyed in one violent act. The trial of Harold Simmons began in late 2023 at the Jefferson County Courthouse. By then, The facts of the case were clear. A respected church deacon had shot his secret girlfriend at his son's birthday party in front of dozens of witnesses. But in court, the details became inescapable. Prosecutors, led by Samuel Green, laid out the evidence step by step. They presented the text messages from Taran Mitchell's phone, showing her frustration and threats to expose the relationship. They showed Harold's replies, angry, desperate, sometimes promising to fix it with money. Jurors saw hotel receipts tied to Harold's credit card, cash withdrawals timed with meetings, and social media posts where Taran hinted at the affair. Green told the jury Harold's motive was simple. He was terrified of exposure. He chose to kill her rather than face the truth. Witnesses, including family members and guests, testified about the confrontation and the gunfire that followed. Denise Simmons' testimony was especially damning. Through tears, she recounted years of suspicion, the moment of public humiliation in her backyard, and the horror of watching her husband execute the woman who confirmed it all. The defense, outmatched, tried to frame the shooting as emotional provocation. They argued Harold snapped in a moment of rage, humiliated in front of his wife and children. They suggested he never planned to kill Taran, only to stop her from shaming him. But the sheer weight of the evidence, his history of secrecy, her repeated warnings, his decision to retrieve a gun from inside the house, undercut every claim. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict, guilty of murder. Harold Simmons showed little emotion as the foreman read it out. Days later, the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Simmons family, the damage was irreversible. Denise moved out of the family home, relying on her sister Carla for support. 16-year-old Kayla, who had already grown distant from her father, now carried the scars of seeing his double life explode. 10-year-old Malik, once his father's biggest defender, struggled to process the reality that his birthday would forever be remembered as the day his family fell apart. The community was left divided. Some could not reconcile the Harold they knew, a man of faith, service, and discipline, with a man convicted of murder. Others admitted the signs had been there all along. The secrecy, the tension, the sudden shifts in mood. For many, the case became a chilling reminder that image and reality are rarely the same. In the end, the story of Harold Simmons was not about reputation or respectability. It was about deception, exposure, and the choice to protect a lie at all costs. A man who once stood as a pillar in Birmingham ended his life not at the pulpit, but behind prison walls, his family fractured, his children traumatized, and his community forced to confront the truth he spent years trying to bury.